London, 1940. Bombs fall from the night sky. Searchlights claw through smoke. Entire neighbourhoods vanish before dawn. And yet, behind shattered brick walls, beneath laundry lines and broken fences, something extraordinary was happening. Not louder, not stronger, but quieter. A survival strategy so subtle, so brilliantly disguised, that enemies never recognized it for what it truly was. They called it victory gardening. But hidden inside that patriotic campaign was something far more powerful, a method we now call the Green Cloak. When Winston Churchill warned that Britain would fight on the beaches, he wasn't just talking about soldiers, he meant everyone. By 1940, German U-boats were strangling Atlantic supply routes. Imported food to Britain dropped dramatically. The island nation faced a terrifying possibility: starvation without invasion. Meanwhile, across the ocean, under Franklin D. Roosevelt, the United States prepared for total war. Shipping lanes were at risk. Resources were redirected to troops. Food became a weapon, and governments understood something chilling. A hungry population is easier to defeat than an army. So a solution emerged, publicly simple, privately strategic. Plant gardens everywhere. They called them victory gardens, backyards, schoolyards, empty lots, public parks. But this wasn't just gardening. It was camouflage. Here's what most people miss. On the surface, victory gardens were about food production. Underneath, they were about decentralization. Instead of massive farms vulnerable to bombing, instead of long supply chains easy to sabotage, food production was scattered into millions of tiny, invisible nodes. A cabbage patch in Birmingham, a carrot bed in Brooklyn, beans climbing a fence in Ohio. Individually, insignificant. Collectively, untouchable. That's the Green Cloak. You know, the genius wasn't just in growing food. It was in hiding survival right there, in plain sight. Enemy reconnaissance planes could photograph factories, sure. They could map out rail yards. But, how do you bomb a tomato plant? Let's break it down for a moment. By 1943, nearly 20 million American households were growing food. Estimates suggest victory gardens produced around 40% of the nation's fresh vegetables. 40%. That's not just symbolic. That's what you'd call strategic redundancy. Over in Britain, the Ministry of Agriculture launched what they called the Dig for Victory campaign. Parks were ploughed up, lawns disappeared, and even parts of the grounds at Buckingham Palace were turned into vegetable plots. When royalty plants potatoes, well, you know it's serious. But here's the deeper layer, right? The Green Cloak method wasn't about squeezing the most out of every acre. It was about resilience per household. If one garden failed, another survived. If one city was bombed, others still harvested. If transport collapsed, dinner still grew outside your door. No central point of failure, no obvious target. So, think like a wartime strategist for a second. If you're planning to weaken a nation, you strike at supply lines, you hit warehouses, you blockade ports. But when food lives in millions of backyards, you simply can't starve that population without occupying every street. The Green Cloak turned civilians into, logistical fortresses. Every household became a micro-farm. Every garden a quiet act of defiance. And here's what makes it even more intriguing. The enemy never fully calculated its impact. German planners expected Britain to buckle under rationing. They underestimated how quickly urban agriculture could offset shortages. They saw gardens as a bit of morale theatre. They didn't see the cloak. The green cloak didn't just feed bodies, it fortified minds. Imagine this: air raid sirens wail overnight, buildings burn, morning arrives, and instead of despair, you step outside and water your spinach. That act says something profound. We are still here. Gardening became psychological armour. Historians often discuss the Blitz spirit, the unbreakable morale of civilians during the bombings of the Blitz. But morale isn't magic. It's built from routine, from purpose, from participation. Tending a garden transforms you from victim to contributor. That shift changes everything. The green cloak didn't just feed bodies, it fortified minds. Imagine this: air raid sirens wail overnight, buildings burn, morning arrives, and instead of despair, you step outside and water your spinach. That act says something profound. We are still here. Gardening became psychological armour. Historians often discuss the Blitz spirit, the unbreakable morale of civilians during the bombings of the Blitz. But morale isn't magic. It's built from routine, from purpose, from participation. Tending a garden transforms you from victim to contributor. That shift changes everything. So why call it a secret? After all, the posters were everywhere, because the brilliance wasn't advertised. Propaganda focused on patriotism, grow your own, plant for victory, dig for freedom. But behind those slogans was a masterclass in distributed survival. The green cloak masked food independence, reduce strain on rail systems, lower vulnerability to submarine blockades, community interdependence, skill transfer across generations. It trained millions in self-sufficiency without ever calling it that. No manifesto, no survival handbook, just seeds. Now, pause for a moment. Look around today. Global supply chains stretch across continents. Food often travels thousands of miles before reaching your plate. We rely on just-in-time logistics, centralized distribution hubs, industrial agriculture optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Efficient systems are powerful, but fragile. The green cloak asked a different question. What if survival wasn't centralized, but scattered? What if resilience didn't look dramatic, but ordinary? During recent global disruptions, pandemics, transport shutdowns, fertilizer shortages, something familiar happened. Seed sales surged, backyard gardens reappeared, community plots filled waiting lists. It wasn't nostalgia, it was instinct. The legacy of the green cloak, well, it isn't just about what was grown or even who grew it. It's about a quiet resilience, woven through ordinary lives. The lessons linger on, tucked away in seed packets, in the memory of hands working the soil, and in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can provide. It's not about heroics, but about persistence, about the way small acts, repeated over and over, can shield a community from hardship. The green cloak lives on in every allotment, every shared harvest, and every bit of knowledge passed down, quietly, from one generation to the next. The method isn't about doomsday bunkers, not at all. It's about quiet redundancy. Here's the core philosophy: distributed production beats centralized dependence. Skills matter more than stockpiles. Visibility, oddly enough, can hide strategy. A few raised beds, maybe a balcony herb box, or a neighbourhood seed exchange. Individually, these things are small, but collectively, they're transformative. And here's the real secret. The green cloak works best when it doesn't look like defence. It looks, well, just like normal life. In wartime Britain, even prisoners of war were encouraged to garden where possible. Soil became therapy, you see. Growth defied confinement. Because gardening does something subtle, it stretches time forward. You plant today for a harvest weeks away. That act, it assumes a future. In the darkest years of World War II, planting seeds was honestly an act of faith. Enemies can measure tanks, they can count aircraft. But how do you quantify hope growing in backyards? The green cloak wasn't flashy. It didn't explode. It didn't march. It rooted. And in doing so, it protected nations not through dominance, but through dispersion. This is the paradox. The most powerful defence sometimes looks like vegetables. While bombs fell over Europe, lettuce grew. While submarines hunted convoys, carrots matured. While governments strategized, civilians cultivated. Enemies searched for factories to destroy. They never thought to fear the soil, because the green cloak wasn't hidden underground. It was hidden in plain sight, in ordinary hands, in ordinary gardens, in the quiet understanding that survival doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sprouts. So the next time you pass a backyard garden or see tomatoes climbing a fence, ask yourself, is it just landscaping, or is it something older, wiser, and strategically invisible? A cloak of green, waiting. History remembers battles, but sometimes the real victory was planted.